since 2016, I can't believe how many times I've said the words, "I don't think that's really fair to Richard Nixon." Welcome to 1999, the podcast. I'm Julia Sermons.
And I am John Brooks.
And today we're doing something a little special in preparation for our discussion of Dick, which should be coming up soon.
This is the bonus features. This is the DVD bonus features.
Yeah.
Scroll to and hit.
But back in 1999 when we had bonus features.
I had a friend who thought there should be some kind of legislation passed through Congress that if your bonus feature was a trailer, it didn't count.
Yeah,
a lot of DVDs were the bonus features were just like a trailer for the movie that you bought. It's it's not a feature.
Yeah,
it's not a bonus feature.
Calling the police.
Yeah, it was a big deal. People have forgotten about this, but yeah.
So speaking of things that people have forgotten about, or forgotten a little bit about, or forgotten mostly about, we're going to be talking about the history of Watergate in the movies.
Watergate, the scandal that launched 1,000 suffixes.
Yep. I forgot. John, I have consumed so much Richard Nixon content in the past 10 days. And I'm not really okay.
I mean, better or worse than consuming presidential politics of right now. It's pick your poison, man. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'd pick it over Pete Hegseth confirmation hearings.
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay, but I'm going to introduce Watergate.
Okay.
Through a quote from my beloved cousin Greg from Succession, sweet cousin Greg. And this is when he's asked to destroy some documents relating to sexual assault on cruise ships. And so he says, "This feels like a Watergate sort of scenario, and I never studied that specifically. But I feel like I'm correct in saying that they all got fucked."
I've never seen Succession. I know I have to. It's on my summer to-do list is to finally watch Succession.
Yeah, it's weird because it's in this parallel. It's really good, but it's in this parallel universe where evil people are more competent, and you just have weird feelings about that. But I think weird feelings in a good way.
Yeah.
But anyway, we had a brief email exchange in preparation for this, and you said that when you and really I too were growing up, Watergate was not yet history.
Right.
Which I thought was an interesting comment.
Right. I mean, it was history, just not in the sense of it was sort of settling into history, right? Not it hadn't been in the history books yet, really. I mean, when I was in middle school in the early 1990s, right? And so I think it was sort of we didn't get that far. You know what I mean? In my middle school history classes, we didn't get to the 1970s. We would ever get as far as World War II, maybe, right? So yeah, I just think that it's, I don't know, it just wasn't, its context wasn't really settled yet, I don't think, and it was still something that was more of a kind of I remember growing up as more of a kind of a journalistic um, uh, reference point than a sort of historical fact.
Yeah,
That
it's
makes sense.
definitely a journalism story, or I think it's been remembered as a journalism story, as much as a Richard Nixon story, I
Yeah.
guess. But so, considering all that, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
What was Watergate?
Watergate was the name of the hotel where the Democratic National Committee was headquartered, or like it's like inner workings were like headquartered, right? Is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
Awesome so
Yeah, yeah.
far.
Yeah. So the scandal was essentially that Richard Nixon, or that people associated with Richard Nixon, were caught breaking in to the DNC to basically get the inside scoop on what they were up to strategically, et cetera, et cetera. And at first, Nixon tried to distance himself from it, and then there was tapes. And he taped himself, basically plotting the whole thing and working alongside the breaker inners. I think one of them was G. Gordon Liddy, right?
Oh, yeah, we're going to get to him.
Okay. And so the scandal was, of course, like, here's a guy who is openly breaking the law to try to get a political advantage, and then just like openly, sort of brazenly lying about it, and then accidentally forgetting that he, likes to tape things and that tapes existed of him, basically, framing himself for doing this terrible thing, and it all kind of came into the public view because of an informant to Woodward Bernstein, who worked at the Washington Post, named Deep Throat, who is later the inspiration for an X-Files character, who in the like late 1990s turned out to be this guy Mark Felt, who revealed himself to have been the informant who tipped off these two journalists to the fact that Nixon knew, and he could prove it. So that's Watergate, basically.
Excellent. A plus.
Cool.
One thing I would just point out is that this Watergate plot was incredibly stupid. It was very clear that Nixon was ahead in all the polls. He ended up winning, and I think the biggest landslide in modern history. So it was just completely unnecessary, like completely inept, and also completely unnecessary. Um, and also, I think we'll talk about Richard Nixon as like a historical figure in a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
but like also just one of the extremely slimy, duplicitous, gross things he did as a politician and then as president.
Correct. Yeah.
Um, so I think we'll start with the canon, right? Which is like the crystallization of how Watergate was remembered historically, which is all the president's men.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you say you've seen that not recently or just once a long time ago.
Yeah, not recently. It's not never a movie I've watched. I mean, for like, hey guys, let's put on all the president's men. um, I think most people my age watched it for some reason in either high school or college. I watched it in college, and I was trying to, like I was saying to you in my email, that I'm trying to like exactly place where it was within the kind of like late, like end of the 90s transition to the W administration, 9/11, and I think it was in that space of time between like George W. Bush becoming president and 9/11, which would have been the second semester of my junior year of college. And I'm pretty sure it was for a like modern US history course, uh possibly a political science course. I don't remember the exact context for it, but like it was definitely a movie that I watched for like college purposes. One that I knew was one I had to watch eventually anyway. And yeah, I mean, like, I love Redford and Hoffman. So yeah, but it's like not a movie. Like it's not a movie that I've like ever found the need. I haven't met someone who hasn't seen it. I've never been like, hey, it's a Saturday night, let's all watch All the President's Men. It's just not that kind of movie, you know. There's a lot of movies like that I've only ever seen once and are unlikely to see again because the circumstances for like seeing them again is seems like wouldn't really arise. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's been a long time, but I certainly like remember it.
So just to clarify, it's like a journalism story, just like we're saying Watergate is a journalism story. And so
Yeah.
it's a story of these two Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and they're cracking the case and trying to, connect the dots to tie the burglary to the highest orders of the White House. And I think it's I was gonna say like maybe you'll throw it on a Saturday night, but I think it definitely rewards rewatching. I think it's become the or it did become the canonical story because it's just so well crafted and satisfying.
Yeah.
And it's just like, they, following one lead after another and just building and building and building and like, oh my God. And the lesson that I think more journalists could take right now is that at first nobody cares about the Watergate break-in, and like it's they keep getting pushback from their higher ups to like it's like you don't have the story, it's not good enough, and they just keep pushing and pushing and pushing.
Hmm.
And um uh the thing about it is like it's not you never see any of the characters in the White House. You don't see Nixon as a character or anything. And the most of the leads you see them following are the kind of lower people on the in the conspiracy. And the once are able to tie it to the White House, it's the end. It's like you just see them typing in the office, and you
Hmm.
see the headlines of what they're typing, and it's like we got this guy, we got Ehrlichman, we got Haldeman, we got all these dudes who work for Nixon, and then at the end you just see them type Nixon resigns, and that's like the end of the movie. And so it's like there's this direct there's this direct tie between the typewriter and
Hmm.
Nixon resigning, and has
Hmm.
this very satisfying quality of like, fuck yeah, we got him. And the Hal Holbrook plays the character of Deep Throat, who
Right.
uh, is coolly smoking cigarettes in
Yep.
dark garages when he meets
Yep.
with Robert Redford. And there's some iconic lines there. Follow the money, right? Is what he tells Redford. I always think of Woodward as Redford. I kind of don't think of Woodward as he is as an actual person.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
And yeah, so there's all these secret meetings in garages, and I love there's a line Deep Throat has that I think is just so actually like encapsulates the whole debacle, which is he says, these are not very bright guys and things just got out of hand.
Hmm.
Um,
Which is like, I feel like that's something we're going to be hearing a lot for the next 4 years, as we live through a never-ending cascade of scandals and disasters.
yeah, kind of
But
like
we'll see.
absolute morons stumbling ass backwards into crimes.
But they're not crimes anymore as long as they're official acts. No, and the deep throat things I think is pretty interesting because I think that there's a whole kind of story to be told there of like the way that personification of Deep Throat and that sort of image of him in like the parking lot, right, like in the shadows, has become itself a kind of like trope, and has been like memed and parodied like all throughout, sort of fiction, like The Simpsons, like from everything, right, from that point forward, including like basically being one of kind of the motifs of like the X Files, right? That like in addition to borrowing the name of the character Deep Throat for the X Files, right? Just sort of the notion of like that's how secret information is like fed. It's like parking garages with a guy with a cigarette in like the shadows.
Yeah, and I think it's like the tie to the X Files is actually really on point because the exposure of Watergate just leads to more and more conspiratorial thinking and like people believing their government is up to all kinds of shady shit and like how deep do things go and like what other kind of secrets are they keeping and like
Yeah.
that's one of its biggest legacies and like a big part of subsequent Watergate movies.
Do you know where the name Deep Throat came from?
Oh, you don't know this is a porn movie?
That's not where it came from, is it?
Well, it's because he was on deep background, like deep background. So
Okay.
that's why Deep Throat. I forget, one of the editors at the Post came up with it.
Really? But
Yeah.
did the porn movie come first?
Yeah. Deep Throat was 1972.
Oh, okay. It's never quite clear on sort of the timeline of the name of the guy and the porn movie, but okay. Interesting.
Yeah. It was kind of like the first porn movie to like, because it was the subject of all these First Amendment cases. It like was the first porn movie that kind of like broke through into
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
normal culture.
Yeah.
So would
Interesting.
people would have been talking about it.
Uh-huh. Makes
Um,
sense.
so yeah, so all the president's men, Redford and Hoffman are in these wide lapels and wide ties, and it's got a kind of cool 70s vibe. So definitely worth checking out, even if it's, requires more attention than
Oh yeah, no, if you haven't seen it, like, and you're listening, go see it.
Okay, so another thing we were talking about is like, so Nixon dies in
94, I think.
94, I think, right? And so we're talking about there's other Watergate movies in between, including a rather plotting one called The Final Days, which is um, the about the second Woodward and Bernstein book that they were able to squeeze out that tells the story more from the inside of the White House. Um, and it's just kind of plotting and like a lot of camera movement and zooms on emphatic, dramatic moments, and just people being like, "Why is Nixon behaving like this?" And then they figure out, "Oh, it's because he's guilty as hell." Um,
Mm-hmm.
so not really worth your time. I'll put a pin in another Watergate movie, but what do you think about the like reassessment of Nixon after his death or at the time of his death?
When was the Oliver Stone movie? What year was that?
95. That's
95.
next up on our list.
Yeah. So yeah, I knew we were going to talk about that next. So I'll tell you that, like, from my sort of teenage memory, right? Nixon was something of a punchline, I think, for like, I didn't really understand a lot about Watergate when I was 15 then, right? Like 13, 14, 15. I knew Nixon was the guy who was like going to be impeached and resigned before he finished his office. And, and there's scandal. Like, I knew the basic fact that he didn't, fulfill his term, and that there was a resignation and the whole, like, victory sign on the
Yeah.
helicopter. Yeah, all that stuff. Right. Um, but Nixon was always kind of a punchline of like scandal and failure and tricky dick, right? Sort of the duplicitous nature of politics and all that sort of thing. And when he died, there was I wouldn't say like a reassessment of him so much as like it's a moment to kind of humanize him and just talk about like who he was as a human being, as opposed to kind of as a kind of cultural meme, which was interesting because that was the first time I was sort of hearing about him in a way that wasn't kind of set in stone with the kind of, you know, sort of cultural conclusion that people had drawn about him. Um, and like there was a reassessment of, or not a reassessment, but sort of a re-emphasizing of the fact that he like created the EPA and that he like opened up China and met with Nikita Khrushchev and like these sort of things that were really sort of instrumental in pushing the nation forward and like addressing some of the Cold War issues and all that sort of thing, but also like a flaming racist and anti-Semite and crook. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't like it was this weird moment of not necessarily like, I don't think there was a real revision going on, but there definitely was sort of a um doing away with the caricature that was happening. And I remember seeing the Oliver Stone movie, and like that was certainly part of that for me, where I started thinking about him less as a kind of comic villain and more as kind of a tragic figure.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like the kind of reassessment was basically hyping up the foreign policy
Yeah,
aspect of it and the relationships with um Russia, the Soviet Union and China.
yeah,
But Nixon, Oliver Stone's Nixon, is definitely it's this idea, or it's supposed to be this idea of Nixon as this great man who had this Achilles heel, or like multiple Achilles heels of like paranoia and persecution and inferiority complexes, which brought him down. So the movie begins with a title, Matthew 16:26. For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? So like there's this very it's really a psychodrama, I would say, of sort of
yeah,
like Nixon's looking at Nixon's character and like what that how that led him to Watergate. And so there's a fair bit about his childhood and growing up on this uh, lemon farm with this strict Quaker mother who having genuine hardship and losing two of his brothers to tuberculosis, and so that's like a thread through the movie. Um, and so we sort of start with Watergate, or start with the tapes, and like sort of it's obvious that Nixon's guilty from the beginning, but then we kind of whipsaw back and forth in time to see how he got to this point. For me, it's kind of weird that the movie is meant to kind of restore his legacy, because the trip to China like gets a very short shrift in it, and like the film seems mostly about him losing elections and whining about it, and then kind of like spiraling out because of Watergate. So
hmm,
um it's this like epic portrait of the stuff we kind of know now about Nixon's character, or what we've decided about Nixon's character, that like he came from this very poor part of California, and he was snubbed by the East Coast elite establishment. He had an obsession of hatred of the Kennedys because people liked them more, even though they were doing their own stupid shady stuff. So Anthony Hopkins is our Nixon here. I think he's pretty good. I think we get some good. He's not trying too hard to do like the jowls and the like hangdog thing,
yeah,
uh, but he does do the kind of posture of like all his suits being ill fitting, and doing the diatribes with the sweaty upper lip. Um,
yeah, yeah. It's like it's an interesting one because the thing about Nixon is that he's so kind of like singular in appearance that it's really like you can't like there aren't actors who look like him, and right, like every portrayal of him is like okay, it's like you're just not going to find a guy who looks like him. I agree with like the thing I liked about Hopkins as Nixon is exactly that, right? Like he lets kind of the demeanor of Nixon sort of fill in the fact that he doesn't look like him, and like weirdly comes across the most looking like him of like all the cinematic Nixons that um I can think of. I do remember just being very sort of like um at a certain point like very sort of like bought into the idea that he was Nixon, right? But yeah, like you can make Bruce Greenwood look like JFK, like it's easy. You know what I mean? Like people can look like JFK. It's not that hard, right? But like Nixon you can't do, and that's just one of the weird kind of elusive things about about him is that like you just can't kind of reproduce him in a way that like you can make Daniel Day-Lewis be Abraham Lincoln pretty easily, right? Like there's something about
Yeah.
Nixon that's just so no one's ever going to look like that guy ever again, which is kind of I think part of the mystique,
Yeah.
and part of like why it's kind of hard to capture him on film, right? In like biopics and that sort of thing.
Another big part of the movie is Nixon's relationship with his wife, Pat,
Yeah,
played by Joan Allen.
yeah,
And she kind of just hates politics and has been drawn into it kind of against her will and playing the good wife. And she repeatedly wants him to quit politics. And we kind of get the like motif of the wife as the truth teller.
yeah,
And she knows him, and she knows that he has this like gnawing need to be liked, that is never going to be satisfied, and that he's never going to be loved the way the Kennedys are loved, and he's never going to feel satisfied. um she has this line where she says, sometimes I know why they hate you.
yeah. Yeah, and I love Joan Allen as an actor. This this performance is always the one that stands. I think she got nominated for an Oscar for this, right?
She
This is
did,
the one that
yeah.
always stands out to me, and like when I think of Joan Allen and her body of work.
Yeah, it's a very subtle yet cutting performance, I would say.
Yeah, I have a question for you. Like, do you? So the one thing about this movie that always kind of baffled me, I had to go back and kind of like kind of refresh my memory on this. This is one I do want to watch again. Having sort of thought about it some more for the first time since it came out, and like I didn't remember what it got in terms of like critical reception, which was pretty positive, and but one of the things that's always kind of confused me about this is like I'm like, how does this line up with Oliver Stone's politics, which I know are all over the place, and that he's a nutcase, and we have a Oliver Stone movie to talk about eventually on this podcast. But like, I don't know how you feel about Oliver Stone. I'm sort of all over the map, but this is a weird one for Oliver Stone to make, right? Because Oliver Stone, I don't know, like it feels like Nixon is sort of the embodiment of everything that he like despises, sort of like to his core. I don't know. Do you know anything about like why he made this movie?
I didn't research it, but I think it's so like he makes this after JFK, which like I think is a absolute masterpiece of total bullshit, but just like
Yeah, that's a great way to say it.
yeah. But it's it's not really like All the President's Men, but it has a similar satisfying, like the riddle. Joe Pesci says the riddle inside the enigma. It's like,
Yeah,
oh, we're following all the dots. Ooh, boy.
yeah,
And I kind of think like um, I do in terms of Oliver Stone's politics, right? I think him being a veteran is like what seems important to me.
mm,
And so like JFK is like has this like intense naivete that like if only he had lived, we would have stopped the Vietnam War and everything would
yeah,
have been fine.
yeah,
And I think like Nixon and like Nixon's relationship to the Vietnam War like becomes interesting to him. And like Watergate encourages more and more paranoia, right? But if you like the Kennedys and Nixon are linked forever,
mm,
right? As these like supposedly stark contrasts in in character and in persona, but then also like they have this shared history of Watergate. Sorry, not Watergate, of Vietnam,
yeah,
uh, and like what could have been done differently, and like I think like he's interested in Nixon's relationship to Vietnam, and he has a little more thoughtful angle to it.
yeah,
But I think he has this kind of uh, like to me maybe naive belief in conspiracies and everything happening for shady unknown reasons. and I think Nixon is still a part of that. And actually, and it's very similar to JFK in a lot of ways in terms of you have the it's not as satisfying, I'd say, but you have this mix of black and white and color footage, and there's it's visually flashy, and there's a certain kind of like fast paced intensity. You have men sitting on benches making cryptic conversations, and the JFK assassination is still in there.
Right. Right.
Because like if you believe in Watergate and that Nixon is keeping those secrets, obviously he's also keeping secrets about the JFK assassination that he also knows
Right.
about.
Yeah.
So he can't really let go of that. Um,
Oliver Stone's like the Pixar universe where like every every movie exists in the same the same like continuum. They're all like one every movie's like referenced in every other movie somehow at some point along the line, you know.
have you seen W? His
No, but I was
W?
just thinking about that. I'm like, does Nixon appear in W? Because that'd be funny if he does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was just never tempted to see it. It's just like,
No.
do not want to see that.
Yeah.
I also never saw Vice for the same reason. I was like, I lived through that. So just for funsies, I do want to recommend a kind of lesser Watergate movie.
Okay.
So I, after all my Nixon content, uh, I still do believe, and we'll talk about it more with the Dick podcast, that Dan Hedaya does do the best on-screen Nixon.
Yes.
Um, but I think the second best on-screen Nixon might be Philip Baker Hall, who you might remember with like many collaborations with Paul Thomas
Oh, I
Anderson,
love
and
Philip
also,
Ricker Hall. Yeah, he's
yeah,
awesome. Yeah.
and also the library detective on that Seinfeld episode. Um,
Right. Yeah.
so he plays Nixon in this wonderful little movie called Secret Honor, directed by Robert Altman.
What?
Yeah, it's on Criterion now. It's based on a play, and it's just like a one man play of Richard Nixon, like um, making recordings, because of course he can't stop making recordings, like trying to tell his side of the story. So it's just basically Philip Baker Hall in a smoking jacket
I see it. I'm
with
seeing it.
a sweaty glass of
Yeah.
bourbon or whatever,
Yeah.
and just like ranting and raving and telling his side of the story, and like, you know, like singing his old school fight songs, and you know, just like it's like the whining that we see Hopkins do in Nixon, but it's just amped up to 11, and just um a wonderful portrayal of Nixon as just a total absolute weirdo, which I think he
Yeah.
was.
Yeah, oh yeah,
Uh,
for sure. For
a
sure. Yeah.
weirdo
Like
with a chip on his shoulder. And there's some conspiratorial elements to Nixon's side of the story in Secret Honor, but they're kind of too fun and crazy to spoil. So I do recommend you check it out.
so I'm looking at these pictures of like younger Philip Baker Hall as Nixon, and I'm seeing like I can see the sort of like glimpses of how he embodies Nixon. And also I'm looking at him and I'm like, Philip Baker Hall might be the one actor who, if you like gave him a little makeup, like did a little bit of Hollywood magic, like you could turn him into Nixon in the same way you turned like, you know, Daniel Day Lewis
Yeah,
into
yeah, it's
Lincoln.
really good, and
Yeah.
it's not a subtle performance in any way, nor should it be for these purposes.
Yeah.
But uh, yeah, it's really a kind of subtle resemblance that I think works really well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um. So yeah, really fun. Secret Honor, really fun. Check it out.
Robert Altman made entirely too many goddamn movies. Like like I've seen so many Robert Altman movies and I love Robert Altman and I'm constantly being like like learning about a new one every few months. It seems like I've never even heard of this. It's crazy.
So you were talking about Watergate becoming relevant again during the Bush era and like
Yeah.
post 9/11.
Yeah.
But there are like no real important Watergate movies made during the Bush era at all.
Yeah. No, so I was thinking about it again, like even after I said that to you, and I realized that I think the thing that really actually did kind of re-trigger, there was this kind of like Nixon sort of reevaluation period, but then the Lewinsky scandal is what I think
Another gate.
yes, perhaps the second gate. I don't know if that might have been when the gates started becoming ubiquitous for every single scandal ever.
I think so.
um but obviously, like, there was a lot of comparisons, right, to like Lewinsky Gate and Watergate, and that I think was when I started learning more about the context of Watergate, because a lot of people were like, no, this is not the same fucking thing. This is a right wing witch hunt, and like here's why. And there's always the debate about like all the presidents who cheated on their wives while in the Oval Office, and whatever. But like certainly Watergate was the nearest kind of cultural proxy to that. And then I think like it stayed because of the kind of sort of like inherent like corruption within the Bush administration, and the failings of like 9/11, and the Iraq war, like all these kinds of kind of nefarious seeming kind of dealings that I think, and people like
John Dean, the
John
lawyer.
Dean, yeah, people like John Dean who sort of reemerged around that time as well as kind of like analysts and writing books and all that sort of thing. And so like, yeah, like there wasn't, which is kind of surprising. But I also think part of the reason why there wasn't, like, people were talking about Watergate but weren't like dramatizing Watergate, is because like Watergate was kind of like being dramatized in real life around us, like as these things were happening, which is like one of the reasons why I think Dick was probably like a commercial failure, right? Was that it just kind of, it felt like it was beginning to be quaint, like beginning to be yesterday's news. I'm not really sure. We'll talk more about that when we do the
Yeah, I mean,
episode.
We'll definitely talk about it becoming quaint,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, and I think that's like, I mean, that's the legacy of Watergate in a way that it was so poisonous, and that in the way it eroded the public's trust in the government and belief in the government, and then like everything after that became more and more uh, acceptable or less and less surprising.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we go into the Obama era. Our next movie, which is Frost Nixon. So this is another journalism Watergate movie, right? So it's like a behind the scenes story of Nixon's like post presidency interview with British journalist David Frost, and like this is like the kind of gotcha interview where Nixon essentially did what he hadn't done, was admit his guilt. So this is the famous line: "When the president does it, that means it's not illegal."
Yeah.
Um,
Which is now true.
yeah,
Yay.
yeah. I mean, there's so many like uh, like the whole Ford pardoning Nixon, and
Right.
like the whole there's all these like norms or like policies established or Watergate that ended up totally fucking us over in the Trump era.
Yeah.
uh but more on that later. You said you've seen Frost Nixon. Do you have thoughts?
Yeah. So certainly I'd also seen the interview, which I think probably was also that same class that we watched All the President's Men, or at least like portions of the interview. But yeah, I mean, it had been a very long time. But I was a big fan of both the actors who play David Frost and Richard Nixon, which is Michael Sheen, and Frank Langella. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of, again, like the moment that movie was happening, that movie felt a lot more to me about the W years than it did about Nixon. Because, this was like in the shadow of us learning a lot more about like the enhanced interrogation programs and the waterboarding and the Abu Ghraib and all of that sort of thing, and Obama's decision to not, uh, you know, investigate or prosecute anybody in the W administration for those crimes, and sort of like, this notion of using this kind of like historical moment and this president making this argument for kind of absolute power, um, but also like these two really great performances with this like two-man show, right? Essentially, that is pretty compelling.
Yeah, so um it's based on a play by Peter Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do have this kind of like intense two-handed scenes, but you also have like some great supporting cast as well. So just to give the background, David Frost was this kind of like fluffy softball television personality.
Yeah, it was like Ryan Seacrest. Like it's basically who
Yeah.
he was. Yeah.
And he paid Nixon for the interview
Right.
a lot of money. So like all the like, quote unquote serious journalists were extremely skeptical, but he was the one who ended up really getting the goods on Nixon. And there's this idea that that was something the nation needed, was to like hear Nixon say he was guilty.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so two great performances, like you said. Like we have Frost playing Michael Sheen, like almost pixie-ish character to him, little impish.
Yeah.
And then Frank Langella he fully leans into the jowls and the
Yes.
hangdoggery,
Yes.
just amps that up. Although I think there's it's kind of distracting, I think, actually. But I think there's kind of like a level of good performance underneath it. It's really kind of interesting performance that like
I agree.
sometimes I'm into and sometimes I'm not.
Well, he doesn't look anything like Nixon. That's the thing. It's like Langella looks nothing like Nixon, and so like he's almost required to bring out the Nixon some other way, right? And that's kind of
Yeah.
the issue.
And like this is post presidency Nixon, so he's like really a
Mm-hmm.
sad sack, and like he keeps playing golf, but then saying he hates golf.
Yeah.
So I think like a very Richard Nixon thing, just like an inability to be happy or enjoy anything. So like I feel like this should be kind of like a breezy, another like fun, like all the president's men, like fuck yeah, we got him. But it's kind of like there's a little hitch in it for me, because it's kind of like a story about a journalist. Not It's like about good journalism versus bad journalism, because like Frost doesn't take it seriously at all first, and he has this team of researchers and producers. Oliver Platt is one of them. He's great. Matthew McFadden
Always.
is
Yeah.
also there, but I think
Also
like
always great.
the real standout, like the real hero of the piece, is this professor who studied Nixon, who's played by Sam Rockwell,
Mm-hmm.
and he's kind of like the voice of truth and the voice of the like really like the moral authority of the film, and being like, this guy did terrible things and he needs to be nailed for them. And so in the beginning, Frost doesn't take it seriously at all, doesn't listen to his researchers, and he gets totally owned by Nixon. And then finally he does decide to do his homework, and then he nails Nixon.
Yep.
So it's a little parable maybe for our times about good journalism versus bad journalism.
Yeah.
So there's this interesting thing that like the idea that it's a journalism story is like, the idea is that David Frost is like, he's not the most serious journalism, but he really understands television. And so there's this line that Sam Rockwell's character says at the end, which was like, he understood the power of the close-up. So the idea of like the image of Nixon looking super doggy and sad, like that was equally important as him saying saying the lines that admitted his guilt.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think uh, there. I don't know why, or maybe like why 2008 is a moment in time where we can like feel sorry for Nixon as this guy who like um just is, you know, totally crushed and can't enjoy himself and is like, you know, believe like completely weighed down by the shame of what he's done.
Yeah.
And like we can feel sorry for him with Langella's performance.
Yeah. Well, I think, that's true of Anthony Hopkins in some ways as well, right? And I do think that there's something to be said for that. I mean, Nixon was a megalomaniac, probably a sociopath. Um, Certainly, like, I mean, he dealt with a lot of mental illness that clearly he was not getting any kind of like adequate treatment for, and should like not have been president. Like, like all of these things are true, and so I do think there's something very tragic, and much the same way like it's tragic that Donald Trump is president. Like it's a tragedy because like this is a person who has no business like having this job and is in way over his head, and there is something deeply like sad, right, about that, which I think is an interesting kind of like parallel to right now. So like, obviously he was a crook and an anti-Semite and a racist and like all of these things and like a serial liar. But there is something like very deeply sorrowful about this person that you kind of have to pity. And there's also just something sort of like unique about his persona that just can't be. He was so much like larger than life. Like he's so much beyond kind of like defies fiction, right? That makes him, if it was just him being a crook, then there's not much to say there. There's not much interesting to say. But right, like I think a lot of people were sort of looking at George W. Bush in a similar kind of light as well, as like something of a tragic figure, because like he was just like trying to please his dad and like clearly just wanted to like paint dogs, and like that's all he wanted to do in his life, and like kind of forced into being president for 8 years. um so yeah, I think he's the first kind of president who gives us kind of permission to sort of look at weirdly like look at presidents in a much more sort of three-dimensional and sort of tragic light. And I think that a lot of that, like had we not gotten the David Frost interview, I don't know that we'd ever really quite have cracked that, because like you kind of almost need someone who is like not of that establishment to like provide that insight. You know what I mean? Like you need sort of an outsider to be able to kind of like finally give you this vantage point on Richard Nixon that you're not going to get by having like Barbara Walters interview him. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's, you know, like they're when they're trying to show Frost as this kind of like lightweight, like his researchers are like working hard into the night, and he goes to the movie premiere of like
Yeah.
smooth. I forget what it's called, something like The Slipper and the Rose. It's like a Cinderella movie that he's a producer of, and he goes to all these flashy Hollywood parties. And in their final conversation, uh, Nixon uh, asks Frost, like, do you actually enjoy going to these parties? And Frost is like, yeah, of course. And he's just like, I never enjoyed it. I never enjoyed any of it. Like, why did I go into politics?
um yeah, it's to please your overbearing mom. There's also, I think, like a really interesting story to be told about the Frost Nixon interview, in that it seems to be kind of almost a genesis point for um this kind of subgenre of like somewhere between serious and tabloid journalism, of the like, really audacious sort of celebrity interviewer, like going for this like really big sort of splashy subject, right? And I'm thinking about like Martin Bashir, and like Michael Jackson, or like, or him and Diana. And Martin Bashir turned out to be like a giant fraud and all sorts of weird things as well. But like Oprah Winfrey, for God's sake, like sitting down with Barack Obama, that sort of thing. This thing that's become almost kind of like normalized, and then look at the way that like the last presidential campaign sort of went out, where like Kamala Harris is talking to like call her daddy, and then Trump's on Joe Rogan, right? There's this like interesting line of the way that sort of, I think, opened up a new sort of way of thinking about how sort of pairing, or like having this sort of like not necessarily political intellectual journalist, right, like reveal a new side to people that has now been kind of like harnessed for the benefit of politicians themselves in sort of an interesting way. But um I'm not sure there's like a real good precedent before that of like a non serious journalist talking to like a very sort of serious figure of history.
Yeah. And now we're in kind of like talking about podcasts, like, going against kind of like legacy media to the extent that it exists anymore.
Right.
And it's like, like, I mean, like, I think there's a real question in the Trump era. It's like, who is a serious journalist? Like
Yeah.
Maggie Haberman? Uh, you know, you know. So let's skip ahead to the Trump era,
Yeah.
because that it really spawns a lot of Watergate parallels and a lot of Watergate content. So in the past, since 2016, I can't believe how many times I've said the words, I don't think that's really fair to Richard Nixon.
Uh-huh.
Like we drew the parallels and then we just blew so far past it.
Yeah.
It's like I really think like Watergate uh became a kind of like in 2017 Watergate became kind of like a roadmap. We're like, okay, are we gonna get him? Like who as like what's gonna happen? And like Watergate was like our roadmap to what we hoped would bring Trump down. And I do think Watergate's become a kind of like copium, or I mean, I don't think it can be anymore because it's just like, so we're so far beyond anything Nixon did. But I do feel like it's been this kind of like thing that we cling to,
Yeah.
hoping that history will repeat itself.
Yeah. And so, the Washington Post fully abdicating its responsibility in such sort of brazen and shocking ways, both in terms of them refusing to endorse a candidate because they were going to endorse Kamala Harris, and then Jeff Bezos being like, "Yay, good job, Trump," and then this week they like endorsed a whole bunch of just awful people that Trump has nominated for his cabinet and all that sort of thing. I do think like if we think about Watergate and like the reason why All the President's Men is kind of so enduring is because it's less about like one political historical moment and more, again, as you say, like a journalism story, and a story about sort of the courage and like tenacity of people who were just like looking for evidence and the truth, and in the face of like really overwhelming odds. I think that there's thematically some things about it that are still probably pretty relevant, but also like one thing you said earlier that got me thinking was the way that Nixon um, sort of destroyed the whole idea of trust in government. And one of the things I think is kind of interesting that's happened is that like in the wake of that, since then, essentially like Republicans have spent the decades since then like working very hard to undermine trust in the media, calling the media liberal media and that it's lies all the time and everything else, and sort of trying to reverse the polarity on that a little bit. And I think when you look at the way that the sway that like Trump has on especially his voters, that like everything he says is true and everything he does is fantastic, and like everything that's, you know, any negative thing about him is a lie. You can call that trust in politicians if you want to, but like that's basically what we're talking about, is that the general consensus is that the media lies and like your politician doesn't. Right. And I'm not, you know, I think that that could probably swing back, but it would require a complete kind of, you know, restaking of the well, reimagining of what like journalism and reporting is, and like you know, a restaking of the territory, um so to speak, right? Because like, you know, this does feel like we're in a kind of a familiar period of history that's like way before Watergate and Nixon. um and that journalism is going to have to like rebuild its credibility and its position somehow, right, to make that happen. But of course, like the main difference between then and now is that then you had a few newspapers and a few networks, and they were all reporting the same facts, and like that's not happening anymore either. So yeah, I mean, I think ultimately like what the lesson like culturally for now for Watergate is obviously not, right, like we should reinstate Nixon as president at this point, because it feels ridiculous to have had him resign over that. So it's not so much that, I think, so much as it is like that this is a struggle between like government and government trust, and also like the fourth estate and trust in that, and how you create like robust, you know, sort of dependable entities on both sides, right? And like the unraveling of that kind of starting with Nixon, and then, you know.
Yeah, well, let's get into the Washington Post.
Okay.
Because like 2017, like one of the first Watergate, not a Watergate movie necessarily, but definitely Watergate inflected, is The Post,
Mm-hmm.
which is earlier, right? It's about the Post printing of the Pentagon Papers, leaks of the
Yeah.
Pentagon Papers, and that going all the way to the Supreme Court. Um, and Catherine Graham, the publisher, right? The Post was about to go public, and so it was a very risky moment to do this kind of really brave thing, right? So it's like this real lionization of journalism, like pushing the edges and like not being afraid. And like it's like Watergate is like going to happen next. There's kind of like a wink, wink, like you see the burglary at the end, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like it's such a parallel to All the President's Men, and that like it has the same like recreation of the post office, and like people are having meetings, and it's like so wanting to recapture that. And you know, so there's this like lionization of the Post, particularly as an institution. And like uh at the beginning of the Trump era, like, right, the Post adopted this slogan, democracy dies in darkness, right? And like they really were braver than the Times in terms of pursuing leads. And like David Farenthold, I think, like did a lot of reporting on Trump's finances. And like they were in the first Trump administration, they were really you know, doing good work. And then now it's just, you know, total capitulation. This is an audio medium, but I did find this incredible cartoon by Michael DeAdder, and it's like two split. It's a split frame, and on one side you have All the President's Men, and it's a cartoon of
Mm-hmm.
Woodward and Bernstein, and then on the other panel you have Bezos sitting in Trump's lap, and it's the caption is "The President's Man."
Oh,
Uh,
yeah. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, so that's a strain of hope, I think, that's died out. But what the other thing that's happened post Trump is like the revisiting Watergate is like we are introduced to the like Watergate extended universe, like all the kind of other characters who made up this saga. And I think a lot of that has to do with the podcast Slow Burn
Yeah.
by Leah Nafok, which is excellent if you haven't listened to it. But it
Yeah.
kind of like it kind of like retold a lot of the parts of the stories that had gotten forgotten. Um, and so we have a lot of like movies and series about these other characters. So one of them is Mark Felt, which is about the man who was like the second in command at the FBI who did end up being Deep Throat. Um, played
Allegedly.
by played by Liam Neeson.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's a very like insubstantial film in a lot of ways. Like it just kind of goes through the beats, and it's just like a lot of it rests on Liam Neeson looking very grave and intent and serious and saying, you know, no one can stop an investigation at the FBI, not even the FBI, and stuff like that. And Diane Lane is his wife, who like wears caftans by the pool and like kind of hates him, but they still do sexy dances together.
Uh-huh.
But I think it's an interesting movie because like the there was this like kind of realignment of like Democrats and Republicans where like during the early Trump era when there were all these investigations, like Democrats suddenly became big fans of the FBI.
Right.
Um, and like felt like oversaw like spying on a lot of people like Martin Luther King and doing kind of all these like really kind of spying on people who are thought to be leftist activists and stuff. And Felt himself was found guilty of that and was pardoned by Reagan, I believe. So there is a kind of interesting tension that they don't fully explore about
Mm.
like
Mm-hmm.
lionizing the FBI.
Yeah.
So like not highly recommended, but kind of interesting.
Okay.
And then something I wish I could. It's very uneven. I wish I could recommend more. Is the White House Plumbers, which is a series on HBO, which is about the real weirdo morons who actually orchestrated
Right. 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 Right.
the break-in, and they were the focus particularly on the two of them: E. Howard Hunt, who was this kind of like former, I think he was former FBI or maybe CIA, and was also a spy novelist and has this really, like glamorized idea of himself as like a figure in politics and history. And it's played by Woody Harrelson. And I wanted this to be a really great Woody Harrelson performance, but I found it a little uneven. But there is a great performance of this incredible character, G. Gordon Liddy, um, who we talked about before. Who
Yeah.
I mean, do you want to describe who Liddy was?
I'm trying to think of like what a good modern parallel is to kind of describe who he is, but like just like a raving like psychopath. I'm like he oh, so the guy that like the character that Joe Pantoliano plays in The Sopranos, like that's kind of who I think of when I think of G. Gordon Liddy. Right? Like just unhinged, very violent. Uh was he like a Marine before?
I think he had some kind of armed forces service. He was a lawyer, weirdly, which I can't
Yeah,
imagine
of
him being in
course.
law
Yeah.
school. But there is at the White House, they uh, open admiration for Hitler. Uh,
Yeah.
in the White House, they said he's a Nazi, but he's our Nazi, or he's Hitler, but he's our Hitler.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
He has this mustache and this kind of really sonorous voice, and a very kind of grandiose sense of himself.
He hosted like right wing AM radio for a while in the 90s.
Yeah, which like talk about the state of journalism and the
Yeah.
trajectory of journalism. But he is played by Justin Theroux here, who does an absolutely,
I didn't know that. I got to see it now.
absolutely fabulous job.
I love Justin
Um,
Theroux.
yeah, and yeah, a lot of like an uneven script, but a lot of fun performances. Ike Barinholtz plays Magruder, who was kind of like one of the middle
Mm-hmm.
ranged man, and just
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, just like a bunch of absolute morons
Yep.
who dreamed up these fancy schemes. They had another plan to lure Democrats from the Democratic convention on a boat with prostitutes and uh, get info on them that way. They cooked up all these crazy schemes, and the Watergate break-in was one of the very stupid things they did. There were also a lot of other break-ins that they fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, there's the kind of upside of this is like, and I want to get into this when we watch Dick, is like, it's a Watergate is a very masculine story. It's a lot about men
Yeah.
um, doing, male posturing.
Yeah.
So there's a wonderful performance in this by Lena Headey, Cersei Lannister, as E.
Nice.
Howard
Love her
Hunt's
too.
wife. And she, Dorothy Hunt in real life, I think, was also agent at one point, I think maybe during World War II. And there's this like great feminine exasperation with her idiot husband, and like, why are you doing these stupid things? And now I have to cover for you. And her just absolute exasperation with him is kind of endearing.
I love it.
So yeah, like a little uneven, a little too earnest, but fun watch.
Oh, and this was recent. This was 2023. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm just seeing the picture of Justin Theroux as G. Gordon Liddy with the mustache, and I love it. Pretty good, like, fun supporting cast. Judy Greer.
Yeah, she's Mrs. Liddy. She's
Yep.
yeah.
Kiernan Shipka. She's great.
Yeah. Domhnall
Cool.
Gleeson plays John Dean.
Love it.
Yeah, I
Cool.
can't wholeheartedly recommend it, but it's fun.
Okay. All right.
So the last film I'm going to recommend in terms of the um Watergate extended universe, and this is someone who was the actually the subject of the first episode of Slow Burn, is Martha Mitchell. What do you know about Martha Mitchell?
Nothing really.
Yeah, okay. So uh I asked my father, who is a boomer, what were his major memories of Watergate, and he said Martha
Mm-hmm.
Mitchell. And Martha Mitchell
Oh, I
was
know who she is. Go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
so
I just figured it out.
she was
Yep.
the wife of John Mitchell, who was first Attorney General and
Mm-hmm.
then headed Richard Nixon's reelection campaign. And she was kind of this fabulous, blowsy, blonde Southern belle with a bouffant, and was she was kind of she was very popular with the press. So the administration kind of liked her, but she was just a total loose cannon and would just like, she struggled a bit with alcoholism, and she'd kind of have a couple drinks and call all the journalists in town and tell them exactly what she thought about everything. And
Right.
so
Right. Yeah.
what happened to Martha Mitchell was she found out about the Watergate break-in and was actually like held captive and drugged so she wouldn't she wouldn't spill the beans to the journalist, but then she did end up doing it anyway.
Right.
um, it destroyed her marriage to Mitchell, um, and actually became a term of art. The Martha Mitchell effect is a situation where people think what you're saying is totally delusional, but then it turns out to be true.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so Martha Mitchell, there's a series called Gaslit with Julia Roberts playing, which I haven't seen. She seems totally miscast. In Nixon, she is played by Madeline Kahn, which is
Mm-hmm.
great, and
Mm-hmm.
criminally underused, but a great performance. But there's a brief documentary, The Martha Mitchell Effect, it's about 40 minutes long. It's on Netflix, and just like a portrait of a really fun broad who broke a lot of the rules about how women were supposed to behave. A lot of fun footage of her. Um, yeah, really interesting portrait of a person who's kind of been forgotten.
Yeah, I remember like when you said that, the Julia Roberts thing. Um and I was like, oh yeah, I don't know a ton about the whole story behind her or whatever, but I as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, I know who she is, how she fits into this fits into this story. But yeah, I always thought it was funny because it's sort of like it's like inverse gaslighting, right? Like the Martha Mitchell effect is like the opposite of being gaslit, where it's like
she knows the truth.
Right. It's like when you're gaslit, you're like being told you're crazy, but the Martha Mitchell effect is when you like say crazy things that no one believes, but they're true, right?
Yeah.
Like it's either way, it's because because women, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, but she's just this like, I guess Julia Roberts is Southern, but the real Martha Mitchell is just this like great Southern brassy broad.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's kind of outside of Julia Roberts' wheelhouse.
Yeah.
It's definitely worth your time, and
okay,
she's just a fun character, although like her ending is very sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was on Air Force One one time, and the press asked her what she thought of the Vietnam War, and she said it stinks.
Yeah. Agreed.
And then she was not allowed on Air Force One anymore.
I'm with you, girl. Yeah, 100%. That's
And actually, I believe during the Frost interviews, Nixon actually said at one point that he thought that if it weren't for Martha Mitchell, there would have been no Watergate.
Like no one would have found out about it.
Yeah, or no one would have cared.
Like there would have been a Watergate. Yeah, the gate part of Watergate would never have happened. But cool.
That completes our tour of Watergate on film.
Awesome. So if you are curious about Watergate and like many of our generation, it kind of got skipped over in your history classes. Those are some things to give you a primer to understand it better, and we'll be back next time with our guest who is struggling through the Los Angeles wildfires right now. So hopefully we'll do that soon, but we'll be back and we're going to talk about 1999's according to Julia, best ever Richard Nixon, Dan Hedaya.
Yes. I will bring receipts.
In Dick, a great movie with a great soundtrack that if you haven't seen, it's great. So we'll talk about that next time. You can find us on social media. Well, just at Blue Sky if you're me. You can find the podcast on Blue Sky and the podcast. You can find Julia at Julia Sermons, right? Just Julia Sermons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm just at John Brooks. And you can email us at 1999@cageclub.me. And until then, don't get caught breaking into the Watergate Hotel.
Don't tape all your conversations.
Don't tape. That's a good one. Okay, that's a better one. Until then, don't tape all your conversations. All right, see you next time.
Do you remember your President Nixon? Do you remember the bills you have to pay, or even yesterday? Have you been on American? Just you and your idle civil set so loud. Leather everywhere, and not a miss left from the ghetto. Well, would you carry your things, sir? Just in case of depression. Sit on your hands on the buses of life.